Welcome everybody to today's webinar titled Crisis Control. My name is Tom Albers and I am the President of Albers Communications Group. What I'd like to start with is a little bit of information about Albers Communications Group. We are a full-service PR and social media agency headquartered in Omaha, Nebraska. We strongly believe that PR and social media go hand in hand and definitely work best when used as part of an integrated communications strategy. Of course, by today's topic, you probably have guessed that our work also includes helping our clients deal with potential crises to limit the negative consequences these types of events can have on their companies and reputations. We represent clients in all 50 states and Canada. Our team of PR and social media specialists helps our clients achieve positive exposure nationally and locally in their operating markets throughout the country. We have specialized expertise working with companies that have franchises and branch locations in multiple cities. On screen is a look at the topics we will be covering today. They are the definition of a crisis, possible goals to keep in mind when dealing with a crisis situation, steps you can take to reduce your overall risk, the basic components of a crisis management plan, including team member responsibilities, tips for communicating during a crisis, the implications that social media can have on managing a crisis, and we will conclude by taking a look at a few crisis management examples. It's what I like to call the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to crisis management. And just a reminder that throughout today's presentation, you can chat in your questions using the chat function, which is located in the lower left-hand side of your screen. And we will get to those questions at the end of today's presentation. One of the most important first steps of an effective crisis management plan is to take a step back and adequately define what qualifies as a crisis for your particular company and industry, because what is a crisis for your company may be different than a company in a different industry. Now on screen is the broad definition of a crisis, and that is a crisis is an event that harms or poses imminent danger to people, property, or to your company's reputation. What I would encourage all of you who are listening in today to do is in the coming weeks, make time with your management team to brainstorm all the types of incidents or crises that you might be vulnerable to. Now the causes of a crisis can vary by industry, but we've listed a few of these most common missteps that can throw a company into crisis management mode. And these include bad decisions by employees, which could include wrongful acts by employees such as perhaps stealing from clients, disregard for existing policies or safety procedures. Consumer activism has become more and more prevalent with the proliferation of social media. You may recall a while back that 300,000 people electronically signed a petition that provoked Bank of America to drop a proposed $5 per month debit card fee. So that's an example of consumer activism. In some industries, devastating accidents are more prevalent than in other industries. A very recent example is the explosion at the chemical plant in Louisiana. If you manufacture a product, you might have to worry about product defects that could cause harm to your consumers. Now these last two on screen, you don't necessarily have a lot of control over, but it might be wise, depending upon your vulnerabilities, to have contingency plans for natural disasters such as hurricanes or tornadoes, depending on what part of the country you're in, or perhaps even terrorist acts if you find that you have exposure to those. One of the things that I am often asked is, so how do I know if I have a crisis on my hands? Well, I wish there was one answer, but there really isn't. When you meet with your management team to define and identify the types of crises that you could face in your business, also discuss at that time the telltale signs that can help you nip potential crises in the bud before they escalate. This all starts by identifying potential symptoms, and these symptoms could include perhaps you're receiving a large volume of calls about a particular issue. Maybe you see a large volume of negative social media activity that is pointed at your company. Certainly the filing of a lawsuit can often be a tipping point that transforms what could be perhaps a simmering issue, maybe it's simmering below the surface, into a full-blown crisis. And of course, negative attention from the news media can be indicative of a crisis. Now the reason, of course, that this definition process is so important is because really the most important thing is to try to identify issues early on in the process, because the earlier you can identify potential problems, the better your chances of preventing the situation from developing into a full-blown crisis. Now, over the course of my career, I have seen many companies ignore the early warning signs, and this almost always will get you into trouble. And we'll talk about that more as we go through the presentation today. The silver lining is that many crises can actually be avoided by taking steps ahead of time. And that's why it's important today to talk about the topic of risk reduction. Now this doesn't mean that you can stop all incidents from happening, so I don't want to send that message. For example, if you face the potential of employees committing wrongful acts, there's probably nothing you can do to totally prevent this from happening. However, by following appropriate policies and procedures, you can put yourself in a much better position to keep the situation from getting out of control. In the case of crisis management, I like to see that the best offense is a good defense. And what I mean by that is taking a look at what are the proactive steps that you can be doing now to prevent your potential crises from happening. Let's look at an example. Let's look at an employee theft situation. Let's say we have two companies. They both have employees who have stolen $5,000 of property and prescription medicine from the home of a client. The difference is that Company A conducts criminal background checks, drug screenings, and insures and bonds their employees. On the other hand, Company B does none of these things. Now in this particular scenario, I think we can all agree that we would much rather be in Company A's position because they have taken reasonable measures to protect their clients. Now you need to make sure you are doing what you can now to prevent potential crises. And these include actions such as following all appropriate laws and regulations. If you do have internal policies in place, don't shortcut them. I have seen this happen a lot of times where companies have great policies to protect their clients or to protect the public, but they're just not followed. And so it's important to make sure that your policies are followed. Look at your policies and correct any that may seem outdated or just might be bad policies. Add new layers of protection that make sense, such as in the example that I just mentioned on the theft situation of a client. Conduct criminal background checks of your employees. This creates a layer of protection for you. Take all allegations seriously. This is one of the biggest mistakes that I see companies make. As I mentioned earlier, the earlier you can identify a situation happening, the better chances are you can really resolve it earlier in the process as opposed to it escalating. Because often a complaining client isn't taken seriously and the opportunity to solve the issue early on is missed. As you begin to put together your crisis management plan, it's always important to begin with the end in mind. Now your goals are going to depend on the type of crises and the circumstances you are dealing with. And your goals really may change as the situation evolves over time. I think it's important to note that these incidents that happen in your business, they're continually evolving. The facts change, and so your goals might subsequently have to change. But some potential goals might include resolving the crisis as quickly as possible. I think we would all agree that that's a very good goal to have when you have a critical incident on your hands. Also protecting your employees, clients, and the communities in which you operate. Adhering to all laws and regulations. Protecting your brand and reputation is a big component of what we would like to achieve during crisis management. And also, one of the things we need to make sure and keep in mind is that while we're dealing with a crisis, that can take an awful lot of time and energy, and we need to make sure that while we're doing that, that we continue to serve all of our clients without disruption. Now, over the next 2 slides, what we'll look at is the structure and contents of a typical crisis management plan. And I think it's a wise idea to have a crisis management plan if you are in an industry that does have certain vulnerabilities. A good place to start in your plan, as you might have guessed from my earlier comments, is to lay out your general goals for crisis management, along with what we discussed earlier, and that is defining the types of incidents that constitute a crisis for your business. Previously, we talked about identifying steps you can take to reduce your risk. These steps ought to be outlined in your plan. You really see this plan as a playbook that really helps identify the things that you can be doing now to mitigate your risk. You also want to outline other steps you can take now to prepare for the possibility of a crisis. If you think about it, when you're in the midst of dealing with a crisis, that is not the best time to have to do things such as compile media lists or put together a list of your clients so that you can contact them, or identify potential advocates that might be able to come to your aid and help you perhaps with this particular crisis through potential messaging. It's much easier to compile this type of information and intelligence before you are in the middle of a crisis. Now, your plan should also outline the various roles and responsibilities of your crisis team. And on the next slide, I'm going to actually give you an overview of some of the possible responsibilities that you could see on your crisis management plan. Your plan should also include your communications objectives. And coming up in a little bit, I'm going to share with you some communications advice. So we'll cover that. And also, your plan should include any resources that you may need to have on hand to help you manage a crisis. And that can include things such as having a media monitoring service in place so that you can know and be aware of what's being said about you, your company, and your situation on online media as well as traditional media such as TV and newspapers. And also determining where is going to be the appropriate place to serve as your crisis nerve center. You know, do you have an appropriate place in your office that can be your crisis control center so that you can operate out of there and make decisions appropriately? Let's take a look at this flow chart, which outlines some of the roles and responsibilities you might see on your crisis management team. And it is a best practice to form a crisis management team and to, in advance, outline specific roles and responsibilities. This is not at all an inclusive list, but some of the roles that you will see on a crisis management team include having someone to serve as the overall crisis manager. This person would be in charge of keeping the plan updated and managing the overall crisis response. But probably one of the most important roles for this particular individual on the team is to identify when your company has a particular crisis on its hands. You know, as I mentioned, it's very important early on to identify when you have situations that could boil up to something larger. Your team also could include various decision makers depending on the particular incident that you're managing. This could include people such as your legal counsel. You know, these types of folks are on your crisis management team to help you resolve the crisis and perhaps help make the issue go away and go back in the background. Communication also plays a significant role in most crises. The communication manager is in charge of helping develop and deliver your messages to various audiences. Now, the spokesperson could be the same person as the communications manager, but not necessarily. The spokesperson is the one who will conduct interviews with the news media if you decide that granting interviews is in your best interest. Also, monitoring what is being said in the news media and social media may fall to the communications manager. This person also could help implement your social media response strategy. Now I'm going to go over 10 communications tips that I strongly encourage you to follow when you are managing a crisis. First, it's important to have a great handle on the facts. I really can't emphasize this enough, including the who, the what, the where, the why, and the how. This does not mean, however, that you are going to share all of this information, but it's critical that you have a strong factual foundation on paper from which to make decisions on which to manage your crisis. Crises tend to evolve over time, so make sure that you keep your facts updated as often as necessary. Also, make a list of all of your critical audiences when you're in the midst of a crisis. And your audiences may change depending upon the circumstances. And when you're making your list of critical audiences, determine for each audience what information do each of these audiences have a right and need to know about your particular situation. But assume everything you share with one audience will be shared with other audiences. If your incident, for example, involves one particular client situation, if you are communicating to that client, just be aware that anything that you share with that client will have the opportunity at some point perhaps to make it into the news media or onto social media. This is an important step. Write out messages and update them as necessary. A good rule of thumb with your messages is to stick with the facts, but that doesn't mean that you want to share everything you know. It's always a good idea, in my opinion, to have your messages reviewed for any legal implications that might exist. And never talk to the news media off the record. Always assume that everything you say is going to be reported. Continuing on with some communications tips, during a crisis, it's very important to stick to your messages. Otherwise, your messages may become murky, and even worse, you could open yourself up to unnecessary risk. Always be truthful and stick to what you know during a crisis situation. It's important not to speculate. That's why committing your messages to paper is very helpful, because if they're committed to paper and you're telling yourself to stick to those messages, then you're very unlikely to step out of bounds and start to speculate and rely upon things that perhaps you don't know in fact are true. It's always important to be responsive to the news media, but it's especially important when you have a crisis on your hands. It doesn't mean that you have to submit to an interview, but you want to make sure that calls from the media are being returned in a timely manner. And finally, this is something that sometimes really gets overlooked, but I think it's very important, and that is keep your internal audiences in mind. And what I mean by that is you all have employees and staffs. You don't want your employees to find out from the nightly news that you have an issue on your hands. And so just keep that in mind as you message. But also keep in mind that anything you share could make it, again, on social media or could make it into the news media. Now let's look at the special implications that the proliferation of social media has had on dealing with crisis management, especially in the last 4 or 5 years. Some of the things we need to be aware of with social media is that it's vitally important to monitor what is being said about your company in the social space. Now, my opinion is that this should be a year-round activity, and you should always be monitoring for what is being said by you in the social space. But as you can imagine, it's even more important when you're dealing with a crisis, because through monitoring, you can actually pick up evidence, perhaps of a potential crisis situation that you may not have been aware of previously. Now, on your social media channels, and I'm speaking of things like Facebook at this point, it might be very helpful to post user guidelines or rules which tell the public what kind of content is tolerated. And we would recommend that you just do this now as a normal practice, as a regular practice, not tied to a crisis at all. What these rules will do is it won't stop people from posting inappropriate comments, but what it can give you is it can give you the foundation to remove posts that have content that might be vulgar, perhaps it's harassing, or maybe it includes defamatory language. When you are actively managing a crisis, it is very important to have clear guidelines on what you are going to post and how you are going to handle what other people are posting on your social media channels. Depending on the circumstances, it may make perfect sense for you to stop posting any type of content until the dust settles. If you think about it, for example, if you're posting about a new product that you are launching and you are in the middle of dealing with a crisis, that could be perceived as being just a really bad decision to make a very promotional announcement like that when your company is dealing with what could be a very public crisis. And also, often it's the case where companies have multiple people who are administrators of their Twitter account, their Facebook account, access to the blog. It's important that all of the administrators are on the same page and they know what the plan is and they know how you plan to handle the social media space during your particular crisis. Now, as the crisis evolves, you may need to change your social strategy. It's very important to revisit this often to determine if your crisis response in the social space needs to be tweaked or changed. Some organizations, particularly I've seen this done with hospitals and public power entities, use very effectively micro websites as a means to provide continual real-time updates during a crisis. Last week I was able to hear a presentation given by the hospital that treated the victims of the Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooting. And during that crisis, the hospital actually launched a micro website. Just think of that in terms of a very focused website. And in this case, it was focused on keeping the news media and the public informed of the latest developments. Now, the lesson here is to just keep the web in mind as a way to communicate to your audiences. Obviously, the web is available 24/7. And if there are updates to your situation, you might want to include those in your web strategy. Now let's take a look at just a few examples. Again, what I call the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now you may be familiar with the recent backlash that JCPenney received when they unveiled this billboard on screen. JCPenney wasn't necessarily prepared for the outcry that occurred when people pointed out that this seemingly innocent graphic of a tea kettle bears a resemblance to Adolf Hitler. Now, to their credit, JCPenney reacted very quickly to the outcry that was happening on social media. And within 24 hours, the billboard was gone. Now, had JCPenney gone tone deaf and ignored the signs, this could have been much worse for them. Of course, we are all familiar with the troubles that Carnival Cruise Lines has had in the last year with accidents and ships being stalled at sea, leaving vacationers in really very deplorable conditions. While the cruise line company has learned many lessons, it appears that it still needs to understand that during a crisis, appearances do matter. In February of this year, the Carnival CEO was called out in the news media, and that's what you see on screen, for attending a Miami Heat basketball game while 4,000 of his customers were stuck at sea on a ship without power, without water. The moral of the story is that during a crisis, we really have to take into consideration that a business as usual attitude can get you in trouble. Now, I've saved the bad label for British Petroleum, or BP, because honestly, we could spend hours talking about the missteps that this company made during its handling of the oil well explosion in the Gulf of Mexico. Most notably, BP has been given bad marks for a few things that were missteps along the way. First off, initially they were pushing the blame away from themselves and onto the oil rig operator. Also, they didn't seem compassionate or aware of the social responsibility, especially early on. And they appeared reluctant to cooperate with the government to minimize the ecological damage. You may wonder, what could you learn from BP's experience that can help you with your business when it may be dealing with potential crisis situations? But really, there are all sorts of lessons to be learned, and they include, before a crisis, take all necessary precautions to avoid the crisis in the first place. If you have procedures in place to protect your clients, make sure these procedures are being followed. And cooperating with the proper authorities can go a long way in resolving a crisis and maintain the public's trust. I have some final thoughts on crisis planning and crisis management to share with you before we get to the questions and answers. Once you have a crisis plan in place, it's always a good idea to test the plan to see how your team responds. We do this with our clients. We conduct tests of our crisis management plans with our clients, and primarily it's really to see how the team works, how the crisis team works. Are they following their roles and responsibilities? And I'll tell you, there is not a case that has gone by that we didn't learn something, that our client didn't learn something about the crisis management process by putting their plan to the test. I would say update your plan at least on an annual basis, because things change in your business and you need to look at it to keep it fresh, and you need to make sure it's responding to the current times. I would also advise you to make some time now to conduct media training with your company spokespeople. It's much better to be prepared now than after a crisis hits. And this is one of those things, media training is one of those things that when you're in the midst of a crisis, it's not the best time to start training your spokespeople. So do that ahead of time. Treat all allegations seriously and have processes in place to deal with any incidents that could evolve into a crisis. And during a crisis, keep all of your customers in mind and continue providing them with excellent service. Before getting to your questions, I did want to tell you about 2 upcoming webinars in our ongoing series. On August 21st, our Vice President and Director of Public Relations, Debbie Hilt, will discuss media interview preparation and share some of her best tips for making the most of each news media interview. And I had mentioned the importance of media training as part of crisis management, and certainly the tips that Debbie is going to be talking about can be applied to crisis situations as well as positive media interview situations. And on October 16th, our Director of New Media, Gina Pappas, will talk through the essentials of planning for PR and social media success in 2014. You can register for both of these webinars at alberscommunications.com/learning opportunities. This is the same place that you can go to listen to recordings of all of our past presentations. Once today's session is over, a questionnaire will appear on your screen. And if you don't mind, please take a few minutes to provide your comments on that questionnaire about today's webinar, or share topic suggestions that you'd like to see us address in future webinars. We would truly value your feedback and input on that. And now I'm going to ask Gina Pappas to take herself off mute and help us facilitate the Q&A session. And if you do have any questions that you have not chatted in yet, go ahead and chat those in.
Okay. I have a couple of questions here. What do you do if someone within your organization doesn't follow this process and starts talking to the media without following the crisis plan that you've prepared?
Yeah, that's I have actually seen that happen before, and obviously it's not the ideal situation. And the best thing that you can do is remove them from the situation, meaning take that responsibility away from them. If if they are truly the spokesperson that has been identified, I guess I would say that's why it's important to, in advance of a crisis situation, identify who the spokespeople are. And often, it may not be the same people who do your typical media interviews. It might have to be somebody that has specialized skills, because one of the specialized skills when you're doing media interviews about a crisis situation is the ability to deflect the media, deflect them away from their questions and bridge to your message points. And so I guess I would say it all starts with identifying the right people to be your spokespeople. And if you do have somebody who goes rogue on you, then you need to remove them from the situation, because that can just go downhill very quickly.
Okay, next question. If you're misquoted during a crisis, or if there's a misrepresentation of the facts in a printed or broadcast piece, what is the best way to handle that?
Yeah, that gets asked very often. In fact, somebody asked me that the other day in a presentation I was giving, and my answer is that it depends, right? It depends on the situation, because if it's a fact that is very central to the situation at hand, and you think it's important to get the facts right and get the facts on the record, then you may weigh towards contacting that media outlet, letting them know about the factual error so that they can correct it. Because as we all know, most of these stories live online, and so that story is going to probably live in the online space. Now, when I said it depends, you might also weigh on the side of, look, we don't want to necessarily keep this crisis situation in the news, because sometimes when you make the media aware of a factual error, what that means is they're going to, the very next day, run a correction, and that essentially keeps the story in the news another day. And so you just have to weigh the pros and cons, how important the error was, and whether or not it's important to get it corrected and on the record. And in dealing with all sorts of different crises, I have seen it go either way, depending on the severity of the error. But as a general rule, and Debbie, I'm sure, will cover this in her webinar on media interviewing, as a general rule, you want to make the media aware of errors and facts that they have on.
Okay, that is all I have for questions.
Okay, very good. Well, I appreciate everyone's attendance today, and I wish you the best of your week, what remains of it. Bye.
Thank you. Please stand by.